All right, everyone, and welcome to today's Chief Data Officer panel. As I mentioned, my name is Mason Belcher, and today's panel will be held on the topic of leveraging data as an asset to support policymaking. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. For those who won't be able to attend today, the session will be recorded and will be sent out to you all within 2 business days, so no need to worry about that. And then as we go throughout the panel today, if you all have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box. And about the last 10 minutes of the presentation today, we'll be doing a quick Q&A, allowing you all to have your questions answered. Now, before I hand it off and really get the panel up and going, just a little bit of background about our moderator today, Mark Evans. Mark is a senior sales engineer at ActiveNav and is based in Washington, D.C. In his role, he helps prospects understand the use of technology and how it can actually enable and support information governance and best practices. Mark has over 20 years of experience in the information and data management domain and has worked on some major initiatives in both Europe and North America. Key highlights of Mark's career at this point have included supporting the development of the world's first national data archive in the UK. He was also the chief architect for the Data Conservancy project run by Johns Hopkins University and numerous other information management projects for leading US senators and members of Congress. Lastly, Mark graduated from the University of Manchester with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Now with that, over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mason, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'm really looking forward for an engaging discussion, and we're very fortunate to have a highly experienced and regarded panel joining us today. We're going to provide many insights and takeaways that will help many of you with the challenges that you face in your own organization. So today, Chief Data Officers are in place in over half of the US states, and I believe it's 29 right now, and dozens of major cities across the country. As public entities begin to realize the value of the data that they collect, store, and manage, the question then becomes, how can that data be leveraged as a strategic asset to deliver services and formulate public policy? So in today's webinar, we're talking to the officials tasked with helping to answer that very question. State and local chief data officers, or CDOs. Specifically, we're going to discuss and explore how CDOs are leveraging data to support policy and decision-making in their organization, how public entities can better manage, use, and protect the data that they collect, and what's next for this ever-evolving role of a CDO. I'm very pleased to say that joining me in today's discussion is Jeanne Holm. Jeanne is the Chief Data Officer and Senior Technology Advisor to the Mayor of the City of Los Angeles. And she helps over 4 million people and 500,000 businesses get access to and use data for innovation, equity, health, and safety. She connects public-private partners for innovations ranging from digital equity to 5G. She's led the delivery of online services, 311, public television, and digital media, and Shake Alert LA. She founded the Data Science Federation, partnering universities and cities to create innovative solutions, such as using artificial intelligence for traffic safety and machine learning to improve air quality. She was formerly the evangelist for open data for the White House under President Obama, and the leader for African open data for the World Bank, and the chief knowledge architect at NASA. She's a distinguished instructor at UCLA, a trustee of Claremont Graduate University, a fellow of the United Nations International Academy of Astronautics on the Global Leadership Board for Time's Up, and an advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Joining me with Jeanne is Tyler Kleykamp, and Tyler is the director of the State Chief Data Officers Network at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation based at Georgetown University. Tyler was the state of Connecticut's first chief data officer and one of the first state chief data officers in the entire nation. In his role as CDO, Tyler led Connecticut's efforts to use data to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of state programs, policies, and services. He oversaw data analytics and transparency, master planning, leveraging open source tools and technology to create cost-effective and scalable solutions to solve some of Connecticut's most intractable data challenges. He's also the creator of Data Ops for Government Framework, which applies lean continuous process improvement and agile software development techniques to data and analytic pipelines in government, something that's very dear to my heart. And Tyler spearheaded the passage of several pieces of innovative legislation enabling Connecticut to enhance data integration and formulated the first ever state data plan. Tyler has also served as chair of the Connecticut Geospatial Information Systems Council, as well as the state GIS coordinator. And finally, but not least, Carlos Rivero. Carlos is the Chief Data Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Prior to his appointment, he served as Chief Data Officer and Chief Enterprise Architect for the U.S. Department of Transport's Federal Transit Administration in Washington, D.C. Carlos has also worked at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's Southeast Fisheries Science Center in Miami, Florida, as a physical scientist and as a research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenthal School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, where he developed a passion for geospatial information systems, ecological modeling, and data. So a very warm welcome to our panel, and we're really excited to have you here with us. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. So in 2010, Colorado became the first state to appoint a chief data officer, and New York City became the first city to appoint a chief data officer. Over the course of the decade that's followed, there's been a tremendous amount of movement around open data and leveraging data as an asset from all sides of government. Initiatives and groups such as the Beeck Center were launched to provide resources and promote collaboration amongst CDOs. Of course, that's quite a pretty distilled version of history of what's still a relatively new role within government, but it brings us to the present day. At this point in time, as I said, 29 state CDOs are in place, as well as in dozens of major cities. So my first question to the panel is, how would each of you describe the current role of a CDO? And what would you boil it down to? And Jeanne, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mark. I think it's interesting that I get this question back in 2009 when we launched data.gov, when I was working for President Obama. We didn't really have this role, although shout out to others, the GIS community kind of had a lot of this underway. And so we established, I think we called them data stewards that first year before we got smart and called them data officers. We established those positions at 175 federal agencies. And I think cities and counties and states picked up on that pretty quick. In my work here, my hometown of Los Angeles, I've taken some of what I did there down here. And I really think that there's a few things that we need to do in local government. The first is sort of training and motivating and helping your departments to release data. Right. So like it doesn't do any good if you are not releasing data, and making that available in human and machine readable formats, which involves a lot of training and motivating. Because I don't know about where you all work, but a lot of our city folks are focused on delivering a service, which may or may not be giving them any expertise in data science. We develop and work with the broader ecosystem too, because you also have to have the demand side. So we want universities, researchers, entrepreneurs, businesses to be aware of and know how to use that data and make ongoing requests of us on the kind of data that they need, sometimes in different formats, often like in different periodicities. So we might publish something annually and they're like, that doesn't do us any good. We need it daily. And then there's also a piece, I think, kind of the core of what we all often talk about with each other, which is organizing, analyzing, visualizing that data. Because what a big part in local government of at least my job is giving information to many decision and policymakers at the city that are elected officials or others who need to understand that and consume it quickly. So I can't tell you how many dashboards I stood up, but being able to do that in a like sustainable, robust way that translates the data into very easy to understand, actionable cubes for folks. And then, I can't talk about any of this without talking about our current situation of the pandemic and the economic downturn and the horrendous things that are happening with systemic racism. I mean, all of these huge societal, cultural issues come to play at least in a city government, where we want to make sure that we're using that data during any kind of these emergencies or emergent issues to really start to think about and drive equity.
So some great comments in there. Carlos, how about the situation in Virginia? I think you're on mute.
Thank you. So thank you, Mark. So, for me, you mentioned boiling it down, and it's very simple. It's to increase the value of our data assets over time by guiding its evolution from information to actionable intelligence. And I love the fact that you mentioned it, Jeanne, the actionable part, because if you make a decision, but there's no action associated with it, then why did you make that decision, right? What was the entire data pipeline for, right? What was the intelligence pipeline for? So really it's to empower people to make the most informed decisions they possibly can to improve their lives, right? To make their lives better. Whether those individuals are the governor and his cabinet secretaries making policy decisions on how to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic across the entire state, or they're individuals themselves trying to make better decisions about whether or not they should get tested and whether or not they've been exposed to the virus, right? And so being able to empower everyone up and down that chain is really what our job is all about, right? Is being able to translate the data that we collect into actionable intelligence that people can actually work with.
And Tyler, how are you seeing this role across multiple states evolving?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I agree that at the end of the day, we're trying to better deliver government services, improve the way we make or inform policy, and so the CDO's sort of role in that we look at as having a few different aspects. One, it's great to have a CDO to lead a government's efforts in leveraging data. And that means there needs to be some sort of strategy around how that's actually going to happen, in a way to prioritize what sort of things they undertake, right? Because I think most CDOs are smaller teams, and so you can't just take on every single data project that exists. I think Jeanne mentioned this a little bit, and then it's building that capacity that exists within government, whether it's from a data literacy perspective, or sort of other aspects around how states and local government better manage and use data. The big piece, I think, is how do we facilitate a predictable process around sharing data, and that's both within government and between government agencies, but also with the public through forms like open data. And then there needs to be some analytical capability to sort of, as Carlos mentioned, generate insights that inform action. And then ultimately there has to be some sustainability of all these things. So it's great to put a dashboard out there, but if it's not being used for decision-making purposes and it sort of dies on the vine, then it probably shouldn't have been created in the first place. So somebody needs to be sort of making sure that these things that are being put out there are done in sort of a sustainable and useful way long-term.
Thanks, Tyler. So we've talked a little bit there about, how can you better deliver services and the importance of providing those insights. And how can we make public data and how can we leverage that public data for public good? I wonder if each of you could describe some of your own experiences and successes where you've been able to achieve that, where you've been using data to drive a change or serve a particular public need. Carlos, how about you kick us off?
Sure, and in this specific position with the Commonwealth of Virginia, the legislation that created this position also mandated that I work on an opioid pilot project. So one of the first things we did is work on that project, identify a community that we wanted to work with. And so the interesting thing about that project is that we weren't looking at state data for state policy goals. We were looking at state data and any other data assets that are available to support and empower community leaders to make the most informed decisions in their respective communities. And so we identified the Winchester community as a community that had a coalition, what we call the enough organizational maturity to have respect and trust amongst all of the coalition members to want to share data with each other, right? So that way we didn't have to start persuading and influencing people on the value of data sharing, right? They already understood there was value in sharing their data assets with each other. They just didn't know how they were going to do it. And then walking in and getting a better understanding of, okay, what is their digital readiness, right? Where were they with regards to their ability to share the data in a format that was machine readable that we can easily leverage? And then how do we integrate that data? But then also how do we do it legally, right? So Tyler had mentioned a consistent process that's predictable that people can follow on how do you actually share data. So creating the data trust model as the first order of the data trust model that we developed for the Winchester community to help facilitate the transfer of data assets into a common environment that we can all leverage to build analytics. And so in that environment, we were able to tie in data from law enforcement, the court system, the probation system, health services, community services, right? A wide variety of different, not just Commonwealth service, but also community-based service, and even a private healthcare organization. Integrate those data assets, build up the analytics and the intelligence that allowed the law enforcement folks and the court folks and the community service folks to see each other's data in a more intelligible way that empowers them to make better decisions. And so some of the outcomes that we discovered as part of this process were that there's a state policy that makes you ineligible to participate in drug court if you've committed a violent crime. Yet in this community, when we looked at the data, there was a correlation between stimulant addiction and violent crime. So because we had the state policy, if you committed a violent crime and happen to be addicted to stimulants, you are no longer eligible for drug court. So as we expand this system across the Commonwealth and see if this correlation still holds, there may be an implication for a state policy change to say, hey, wait a second, that eligibility criteria on not committing a violent crime is something we need to take a closer look at because of the addiction to stimulants and its correlation therewith. In addition to that, we're also identified age of first use of a substance and then age of first interaction with law enforcement to kind of give you a relative intensity of the different drugs that we're talking about. So from an alcohol perspective, it's 40 years. For marijuana, it's like 23 years. For cocaine, it was like 16 years. For fentanyl, it was 6. Right? So being able to look at those patterns and look at the relative intensity of the different drugs that we're dealing with on the streets is something that, they never had before. Also with that age of first use, they were also able to identify where their outreach efforts were falling short. Many of their outreach efforts are focused on high school students when a lot of those students had already been, experimenting with drugs in middle school. And so these are hard data that would allow them to pinpoint based on the different types of drugs that they were looking at, where were these individuals first interacting with those drugs? And then lastly, one of the most empowering things was, being able to connect overdoses or the overdose events with law enforcement so that our law enforcement, our drug and gang task force personnel were able to see when the number of overdoses were exceeding the nominal threshold and then be able to drop everything that they're doing and respond to that event. And in one case, we had the Richmond Overdose Symposium earlier this year. And the leader of the drug and gang task force mentioned an event that happened late last year, that they saw an increase in overdoses. They were able to go to drop everything that we're doing, go to the hospital, interview all the individuals that were that had overdosed, identify where they were getting their drugs, and then go execute a search warrant and lock that down. So for the next 3 weeks, they had 0 overdoses in the community. Right, that's a pretty powerful impact on the community itself, to be able to leverage those data assets in the right hands of the right individuals to allow them to take the actions they needed to take.
You're right. That's a really powerful example. Thanks very much for sharing that, Carlos. Jeanne, with such a large population in LA, I'm sure there are many success stories that you can comment on.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly mention 3. So the first is the Shake Alert LA, which is an earthquake early warning system that we do in coordination with the U.S. Geological Survey. And I just want to say a shout out to some of our colleagues in Alaska and hope you're doing well after the earthquake up there recently. So Shake Alert LA combines the ability to use in-ground sensors that are up and down the West Coast of the United States. So it works for all West Coast cities and counties and organizations and states. And then it allows us to detect when ground shaking occurs and then do a calculation on the back end to be able to figure out at any geographic location how intense that shaking will be. And then we have a calculation using anonymized data. We're not tracking anybody's location. We assign them to a large 10-mile square grid. And we are able to send an electronic signal to people via a mobile app in advance of that shaking actually occurring to where they're at, because ground shaking travels at the speed of sound and electronic signals travel much faster. So Shake Alert LA uses this combination of kind of geeky sensor technology, but we manifest it in a way which is completely actionable. So kind of going back to what Carlos and Tyler were saying originally, is none of this works unless it's actionable. So you get an alert a minute before you feel shaking and you know how intense that earthquake's going to be, and that's hugely relieving. Another quick focus of how data is helpful and I'm going to switch this around to a previous job I had with the World Bank working in Africa, is and kind of harking back to some of all of our GIS background, is in trying to work with people for whom it's very difficult to get even access to data literacy. Many of the communities we worked in especially during the Ebola outbreak, didn't even have electricity. So like, how do we use data to make things change there? And one of the things that we were able to do is do data literacy training with data journalists. So these are journalists in newspapers. Okay, so let's kind of level set. Using newspapers to be able to communicate information about government corruption. And so we did a training where we showed them how, whenever they did have internet access, they could look at NASA satellite data, looking at where road construction was supposed to be occurring or other construction, and be able to determine whether progress was being made or not. And this was a hugely empowering ability to kind of use data in a way that manifestly changes the way in which a community can start to provide truth behind some of what they're hearing, and to do it in a way in which some people are able to help augment the government communication. And then the last piece I just want to mention briefly, because I'm super excited about it, is a new project that we're doing with NASA around air quality data. And we're actually looking for sister cities and counties and states. So if you're interested in partnering on this, this would be awesome. And what we're doing is combining the NASA satellite data, which is all open, with our Internet of Things diverse group of city sensors, some of which are open, some of which are a mess. And so part of this is normalizing and standardizing all this data from all of our department sensors on street sweepers and streetlights, and putting that data together with some really interesting algorithms and machine learning that help us to predict what air quality will be like in the future. And so this is a really exciting project where we're using public data that we have that could be made and will be made public, and then putting a wrapper of AI around it that helps other cities also make those same kinds of projections. And really, then we work with a lot of health companies so that they can get that information out to their clients and their patients.
I'm glad you mentioned the Internet of Things in that last example, because I think that just opens up the doors of possibility to endless possibilities. I think we're going to see more and more innovative uses of that data as we move forward. I appreciate those nice examples. So it leads me on to the next question, which really focuses around transparency, and it's a huge focus right now. Especially as data privacy and data ethics have gained a lot of attention in recent times and really risen to a national prominence. People want to know about who has data about them and how it's being used. And in my role at ActiveNav, I certainly get asked questions around some of the regulations around data privacy, such as GDPR and CCPA, almost on a daily basis. And then, in some of your examples, you talked about the use of open data and making that more widely available so it can benefit society. And, you've talked about some great examples there, and we've certainly seen more during the current pandemic. But on the flip side of that, that openness and that usage, we've really got to think about data security and how do we prevent that from getting into the wrong hands? We've seen lots of instances of breaches lately. And I'm always surprised to see how much personal information is available through simple Google searches. So where's the balance? What can public entities do to manage both of those considerations? And Tyler, I'd like to start with you. What kind of advice has your organization been giving out in this particular area?
Sure. So I think one of the things we're seeing, especially within states, is the rise of either like a chief privacy officer. Sometimes that's a standalone role. Sometimes it's more like a CISO, chief information security officer. But what I do know is generally with the chief data officer position, for the most part, it's not their responsibility to protect individual privacy. Sure, there's a responsibility to sort of physically secure data, but not necessarily the CDO's role through some mandate to protect the privacy of individuals whose data are stored within the state. And I actually think that's a really good model because we talk a lot about checks and balances in government. And so if on the one hand, we have a chief data officer whose real mission is to, find new and innovative ways to put data to use within state government, and then we're to like sort of burden them with the additional sort of responsibility of ensuring privacy, I think it puts them in an untenable situation to be trying to do two things that can sometimes be at conflict with one another. Now, we've seen a couple states where that sort of chief privacy officer lives within the CDO shop so that they can be there as both an advisor to the CDO to help make sure they're following all the laws and implementing the rules, but also to be an advocate for improved data sharing in responsible ways. And so I think for me, and I think what we're kind of seeing in a very broad sense is in government, it's not sort of the wild west where people are like falling all over themselves trying to share data across agencies. It's actually quite the opposite. So, you know, there are inadvertent data breaches that occur through the same sort of vehicles that happen in the private sector. But typically what we're not seeing is somebody who's overzealous trying to share people's personal information across state agencies.
Okay. Carlos, how's the situation in Virginia? Have you got that separation of roles, or is it still falls under your governance?
So it does fall under my governance, and we do consider it quite a bit. And like Tyler was saying, you know, the good thing is that data security doesn't fall under my governance, and that's a key differentiator, right? So, you know, yes, I am cognizant of data security, and I am very, you know, prudent about how we share data, but I'm not as focused on securing all of our data assets, because that is a major conflict in terms of, you know, we're trying to make data accessible, and at the same time, we're trying to lock it down, right? And so you really can't have those different personalities embodied in the same individual while you're doing your work professionally, because it'll drive you nuts. So we do have security officers, and we have, you know, a great chief information security officer in the Commonwealth. But on the privacy side of the house, you know, one of the things that we've noticed, and Tyler kind of mentioned this earlier with that consistent data sharing methodology, right, is, you know, when you don't have consistency in the way you share data, you end up creating a point-to-point network of sharing across multiple agencies in multiple ways, and you now have created a you know, multiple levels of vulnerabilities for the data that's being shared, because you now have PII flying all over the place where people are trying to integrate data at the individual level, right? So when you try to do data integration at the individual level, you need PII to be able to make those connections, do the entity resolution. And so if you're doing this all ad hoc or point to point, then you end up creating lots of copies of PII everywhere, and that exponentially increases your vulnerability. So within the Commonwealth, what we've done is say, well, we're going to do away with all that. We're going to really focus on this data trust model, where really the PII flows into one central environment, the office of the CDO, and then in that environment, we then do all of the entity resolution and matching across all the different systems, so that when we want to match individuals and integrate data, we do that using a crosswalk table that has no PII in it at all, right? So it's all within a secured enclave. We then utilize that crosswalk table. So whenever a data trust user wants to leverage integrated data, we use a crosswalk table to identify which of the individuals across all these different systems match up, and then we provide them with the de-identified data. It's still restricted use. It's still a sensitive data set, but it doesn't have any PII. And that's how we've been able to deal with that aspect of the equation, of the privacy equation. And at the same time, because we've got this system that allows me to determine where do you exist in all of my different systems, I can use that same table. If you as a consumer come to me and say, we haven't built this yet, so we're in the process of doing it, so don't come to our website looking for it yet. But you as a consumer can come to the system and say, hey, where is my information across all these different systems? Who knows anything about me? And then we can provide that as a report back after you've authenticated your identity, of course. But yeah, so those are the kinds of things that we're working on at a holistic enterprise level to be able to tackle some of these issues, because privacy is a huge concern for all of us working in the data space.
It sounds like you made a good start on that journey, Carlos.
We're definitely running. I don't know. Yep. I don't know how far along we are, but we're definitely running in one direction. That's for sure.
So, Jeanne, how about the situation in LA?
Well, we have a great CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, who looks at the systems and sometimes at the data when we call them in to kind of look at that aspect. But I get to live in a schizophrenic world. So I am both opening the data and restricting components of the data. So kind of to what Carlos was saying, we have a program called the Angelino account. Here in Los Angeles, we're all Angelinos. And what that does is it provides a single city sign-on. We started rolling this out earlier this year. So we've got about 100,000 accounts, but by the end of the year, we should have over 1 million, 1.5 million accounts established. And it's an integrated way, contactless government, an integrated way to connect to all city services, but it also provides the ability to start to identify where individual data is, which kind of city departments are consuming that individual data, and then to be able to present back, as Carlos says, back to people like, here's what we know, and here's what's shared with LAPD versus maybe here's what's shared with animal services in the zoo, right? So people may have a very different opinion about the kind of data that they want shared within the city, and we want to respect that. And in fact, we're in the midst of standing up a set of public workshops this month and next around trying to understand how people perceive that need and what they want to do. And we're going to focus on things like our elderly population, homeless, immigrant population, businesses, and that kind of thing. I think the other thing too is that we rigorously de-identify information and anonymize information. So like on Shake Alert LA, we know that you were in a 10 square mile grid, but we don't know where, and we don't track you. So, so the idea is that we want to anonymize to whatever point for what we need to have as actionable information. And then we want to rigorously protect that information that you share with us, and then not allow others to share further. So this integrates with a lot of our procurement language and our contracts. We have a digital code of ethics that we're just publishing, and a digital bill of rights as well, that kind of holds people accountable for algorithmic bias, but also issues around data protection, privacy, the horror of organizations that think that they can resell data once they get their hands on it. So we just really feel that it's always on us as a city government to be as aggressively, vigorously protective as possible of our citizens' private data.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate those insights. Very relevant to today's society. So I want to talk about data efficiency. So when you're collecting all of this public data and storing it, and you can very quickly find yourself drowning in that sea of data. Many organizations are already dealing with content at the petabyte level, and some are even at the exabyte level, which years ago seemed like a distant horizon. So how do you go about prioritizing what you do? How do you do more with less? And how do you more efficiently manage that data? Jeanne, I'd like to start with you again.
Sure. Well, in California, we don't drown, we surf. So I like to think of us as surfing through this. It's navigating the data and organizing it for people in such a way that they can easily find what they need. So we may have, tens of thousands of data sets with, hundreds of millions of attributes and lines in it. But what's really important is that people are getting quickly to data that's stating what they want. So it has to be both like a query and a search component, but also really structured metadata. I think Tyler was talking about that earlier. If we don't have context around the data and some structure to it, and standards, it's really difficult for people to kind of understand the context. We want to make sure the data is really clean, because otherwise you are drowning, right? So even with a beautiful wave and you're trying to surf it, if it's filled with trash, it doesn't do you any good. So you want the data to be super clean. And we do a lot of work with our departments to help them with that. And we have two groups that help us. One is we call data angels, because we're the city of angels. Data angels are young to mid-career professionals in data science or a related field that volunteer to help us on specific projects, including helping us clean data related to specific programs. And then we also have our Data Science Federation, which is 18 universities around Southern California. We extend this to our 88 sister cities in their area as well. And each year we have students and professors working on data science problems. So what this means is that this whole idea of efficient collection and organization of data, we are constantly kind of having folks help the departments who who may or may not be prioritizing that, or maybe don't understand some of the structures. And then we're also really focused on making sure that not only are we working with our businesses who consume that data and our community-based organizations, but we ourselves are running independent, constant checks on how well that data is cleaned and how efficiently it's being managed.
Excellent. I think I'm going to steal some of your taglines there and take them away with me. I like the surfing the wave of data soundbite, and I'm going to start referring to people as data angels myself. So I appreciate that. Tyler, what about some guidance that your organization has been giving out on this particular area?
Yeah, so I think there's two, like, largely, I love the background, Jeanne. There are two sort of, like, effectively, I don't know, meta things or non-technical things that I think are sort of underpin this. And one is just like actually understanding what data you already have and are collecting across an organization, so that way people have some awareness of what already exists, and you know, they're not duplicating effort or collection. So, you know, actually having a proper inventory of your data. The other piece is that, especially in government, I think a lot of the data that's collected is the result of a policy decision or a law or a program that's been created. And so it should really start with actually just collecting the minimum amount of information from an individual that's necessary to fulfill whatever the mandate is, or whatever the eligibility criteria. So we have a bad habit of in government of saying, well, if we're going to ask people for these 10 things and they're already here filling out a form, let's just ask them for another 10 things that we think might be useful down the road. And so that gives us a bunch of data that we may or may not need, and it adds this additional administrative burden on you know, the individuals trying to access services. So it's really sort of thinking up front, do I even need to collect this data? Like, what am I going to do with it down the road?
Awesome. Yeah, I like that notion of collecting the minimum amount. You know, something we advocate to a lot of our clients as well. Carlos, anything to add from your perspective?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've had those discussions about collecting the minimum amount, and you know, when you don't have a back-end data integration strategy where you can leverage the data elements of other systems that are bringing, you know, they're bringing the same information or different information about the same individual together, you end up having to collect duplicative data, right, in other systems. And then some of the times we get into discussions about, you know, should we collect gender? Should we collect race? Should we collect ethnicity? And if the business case doesn't need it, then why are we collecting it? But then we get into societal issues when we're talking about racial injustice and other types of issues. And then how do we monitor that we're actually meeting the needs of the populations we're supposed to serve if we're not capturing any information about the population itself, right? And so, you know, therein lies that again, it's almost that schizophrenia, right? Where, you know, you want to be able to collect the right information to do the business that you need to do, but at the same time, you also need to be able to get additional information that will help you understand from a performance management perspective, are you meeting the needs of the stakeholders you're supposed to be reaching? And so, you know, for us, that's where the data integration component really plays a key role in being able to harvest data elements from other systems that are supplemental to what's already being collected, so that we can take advantage of the reuse, right? So we're not having to recollect the same data over and over again, and have that typical government experience where, you know, people are entering their name, address, phone number, all the same in different systems for different types of services, when it should be more unified. But going back to the data discovery component that Jeanne had mentioned, you know, it's and we talked a little bit about this earlier, you know, data documentation is a great job for somebody else to do, right? You know, no one wants to do it. The data stewards don't want to do it, right? And so, you know, we in Virginia have actually built a process where, you know, as we're doing projects on a variety of different, you know, intelligence projects or data projects or modernization projects, that we can actually start documenting those data assets in a separate system outside of the transactional environment that they're working in, so that it has that degree of separation from not just from a data security perspective, but also not to get in the way of the people that are actually doing the day-to-day work, right? Because we don't want to hinder their day-to-day operations. We want to be able to augment that. And so, you know, being able to have a process by which we can register our data assets into the data catalog, have different teams working on the documentation, be able to have a workflow where, you know, data stewards can approve and then data owners can publish. And when they publish, that metadata then becomes available on our public site so that the public can consume those metadata assets and get a better understanding from a transparency perspective what data assets we have available, not just from a public side of the house, but also from a restricted use data side of the house.
Excellent. So it's all about generating that awareness. Okay, so Tyler, I want to give a shout out to the Beeck Center that recently been building out a great toolkit of resources for CDOs to pick up and use, and one of those was a recently released CDO playbook. And something that I saw in that was really dear to my heart was a line that goes along the lines of the value of data is determined not by the data itself, but by the story that it tells and the actions it empowers us to take. That really resonated with me. So could you tell us a little bit about data storytelling and how CDO should prioritize that concept?
Sure. So I'll sort of draw upon an example from my time in Connecticut, where a major initiative of the governor was criminal justice reform, and that's actually a quite bipartisan issue. But what was maybe more controversial about this administration's proposal was that they were basically eliminating mandatory minimum sentences for possession of drugs in drug-free school and daycare zones. So that's 1,500 feet around schools or daycares. And as you might imagine, that was sort of an unpopular proposal because nobody wants drugs near schools or daycares, except that what was happening is that in our urban communities and people were being disproportionately held in prison simply because they were in possession of drugs within their own home. So you could easily, in any urban community, you could easily live within 1,500 feet of a school or a daycare. Now, in more affluent and suburban communities, they were not as significantly affected by this. And so a really simple thing that we did was make a map, right? Here in New Haven, Connecticut, Bridgeport, Connecticut, these are, here are all the schools and here are all the daycares and here's a 1,500-foot circle around them. And guess what? The entire city is covered by those circles. And so that means, if you threw a rock, it was landing in an area that carried a mandatory prison sentence for possession of drugs. And we showed those maps of different communities. And then on top of that, we brought in the demographics behind that, right? So to show that primarily the residents that were living within these areas were predominantly Black. And so once you sort of began to show legislators, the public, the impact of this policy and sort of illuminate what that means, and the fact that just by doing something that somebody else in another community is doing in their own home and not carrying the same sentence was really impactful. Now, my role in that wasn't to do much more than, frankly, identify what the point was, that was trying to be made was, where the sources of data existed that could help them articulate this, and then maybe what's the best platform to do this. So is this, is it better to show this as a map and then sort of help them, get it all organized and sort of out there. And so I think that's the sort of role of a CDO, is not to be the storyteller, because it's impossible to be a subject matter expert in criminal justice, transportation, child welfare, health and human services, right? Like governments do a lot of stuff. So it's really taking a step back and saying, okay, what's the issue? What's the story we're trying to tell? What's the challenge we're trying to solve? What's this critical question that we're trying to answer? And then, okay, how can we, identify the sources of data that can help us do that? What are the tools we need to help kind of pull it together? And then maybe, what's the best way to analyze it or best platform to disseminate it, but working really closely in partnership with subject matter experts.
I appreciate that. Thanks for that. So continue on the theme of quotations. Carlos, you've said in the past that if it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job, it being the management of data. And that's a pretty convincing statement on its own. But when you think about that in the context of everything we've been talking about today, it's really compelling. And for states and cities that have thought about implementing a CDO but haven't quite got around to doing it yet, or they're holding out for whatever reason, maybe the pandemic has caused them to put it on pause, What else would you say to them to convince them that that's the right thing to do?
Well, I mean, I'll go back to what Tyler was saying is, you have to empower the storytellers, right? And the storytellers are those in the lines of business that are the subject matter experts and the analysts and the associates and the folks that are, working in that line of business on a day-to-day basis, that you're empowering them to help make the best informed decisions that they can. But at the same time, you are sitting between technology and the business, right? So, the wonderful thing about our roles is that, we get to play translator between these two completely opposite, domains, but that rely so heavily upon each other. And so, when you have someone who's accountable for making sure that the technology that is being implemented is 100% supportive of the actual need that's being described by the business, and at the same time that you're translating what the business needs are back to the technology to make sure that you are able to transcend whatever technological constraints there may be to facilitate access to those data assets that allow them to derive intelligence. That's primarily the role that we play, right? Is being able to be that one person who's accountable for making sure that that communication and that collaboration exists and exists sustainably. Being able to do that on an ongoing basis requires someone to take that leadership role and be accountable and responsible for making sure that it happens.
That's good stuff. So, so no panel in recent times would be complete without a small discussion around COVID. So, Jeanne, when you were appointed to your role fairly recently, you had a broad vision in your announcement of laying down innovative data-driven solutions. Has COVID kind of had an impact on that? Has it forced you to expedite some of those visions? Has it put them on ice? What kind of impact has that had on your role?
I think it's had a dramatic impact on everybody's role everywhere. And I appreciate you bringing this up. First of all, just for those of you who've either had COVID or have as family members had it or have suffered from a loss in your family, my heart goes out to you. And to the rest of us, just make sure you wear your masks and just be safe. So part of what we've done around COVID that changed was, it's not like the other work has gone away. We still have a data strategy. We still have our Angelino account, which is doing digital transformation of government and a single sign-on to all city services. We still have a whole variety of other programs, but we've also added a whole set of social programs that don't normally happen at the city level. It normally happens at the county and state level. But we've been providing home delivered meals, 60,000 meals a day to our seniors so that they don't go outside at risk. We've provided over $40 million in donated funds to Angelino's most in need. We have provisioned 9,000 people in our public housing with free internet through the end of the school year, high-speed broadband. So there's just this whole other set of sort of semi-related courses, actions that fall within the realm of the CDO's office, because during a pandemic, everybody does whatever's needed. And then I think part of it too is this issue of, making data actionable, which we've talked about before, but now we're talking about people who are not data scientists. We speak 220 languages in LA, so they may not speak English. And so we have to convey information and data to them in ways that are really understandable and actionable for them, that still take into understanding the fact that for a lot of people, they don't have the privilege of working at home, or they're out of a job, or their business is closed. And so how do we help motivate and convince them to have safe behaviors and to get the services and support and to listen, to what is needed. So we've done a lot more work in sentiment analysis, looking at social media across multiple languages, and just doing a lot more, although we don't get together physically, obviously, but a lot more interaction with the public and with our community-based organizations that are in touch with a lot of the folks in need. And so I think the switch that COVID has had is maybe a more humanistic approach, and one which focuses much more on us listening and then responding than necessarily, open data is often a bit of a broadcast and then listen.
I would love to explore some of those in much more detail. They sound absolutely fascinating. interested to learn more, but I'm cognizant of the time, and I know that we have some questions from the audience, and I'd like to be respectful for those. So I'm going to turn it over to Mason, who's going to field some of the questions that have been coming in throughout this webinar.
Are you using AI to further leverage the value of your data for service delivery or policy decisions? If so, what type of data or what type of ethical use of AI issues are you facing? For example, bias and et cetera?
Yeah, so we are using artificial intelligence. Again, I think there's a range from sort of simplistic algorithms to much truer AI. We look at the ability to do that in a way that obviously rigorously protects individual data. So even around air quality, we're making sure that air quality data is provided in an open way to health organizations rather than us trying to provide it directly for health purposes. We let that kind of intermediary work. And then the other thing I think that's important is that I firmly believe, as does the mayor, that bringing diverse voices to the table in the development of the algorithms is really important. So that's why we reach out through our Data Angels and Data Science Federation. So that way we have representation across ethnicities, the gender spectrum, with different age groups, people even, not necessarily in Los Angeles. But the idea is that having more transparency and diversity in the development of those algorithms really helps to make sure that we are not unintentionally putting bias in them.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Jeanne. And just one more before we really wrap things up, leave it open to anyone who has an answer. Are you able to identify data linkage opportunities within your jurisdiction or enter jurisdictions that allow you to augment the value of your data assets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the main things that we work on is looking at what are the different data elements that are being collected across all the different lines of business and how we can integrate them to create synergistic value for all the different problems that we're trying to address. And we deal with a lot of complex issues that are not addressed by any one particular agency. I mean, the opioid epidemic was definitely one of them. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic response is another. We also have maternal and infant mortality. We have recidivism. We have a variety of different complex issues that we're trying to address at the state level, and I'm sure you guys are addressing it at the city level as well. That require the integration of data assets from a wide variety of different agencies, and so facilitating that conversation between all of the different agencies and how they can work together to bring those data assets together is really one of the main functions of the governance framework, right? The data governance framework. Not only are we talking about data stewards participating at a data governance council, but we're also talking about executives participating in the executive data board, understanding the role that they play with being able to address some of these complex issues. And then ultimately, you have the Virginia Data Commission, which is looking at these overarching, complex, multidisciplinary problems, and being able to assign goals and objectives to those problems, and then having those executives that sit on the executive data board translate those goals and objectives to performance targets that their specific agencies can hit.
Yeah, and I'd just like to sort of follow up on Carlos's point. I mean, I think that if you think about how much of your own personal information you're giving over to state or city government, whether it's for taxes, a driver's license application, some other type of thing, if there's a program that requires you to provide that type of data, there's also a law in place that protects or sort of says what the governmental entity can and can't do with that data. So in many instances, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's that the rules around what you can and can't do with it and with whom you can share and in what form, one, are maybe not very clear. And there may be instances actually where you have state and federal laws sort of conflicting. So in many instances, it's less about the technical ability or the knowledge that it exists and more about the sort of legal implications of whether you can or can't even do it.
On closing, I've got one last question. We started with our history lesson. We've had some good conversation about the role of a CDO, but for each of you, in 20 seconds, what changes do you anticipate for the role of a CDO in the next 3 to 5 years? Start with Tyler.
That's a great question. I definitely think that we'll start seeing more in the area of things like AI and predictive analytics within the CDO role and sort of defining strategies. So I think moving less from the sort of core data management pieces and more into the emerging things like AI, robotic process automation, stuff like that.
Carlos, I saw you nodding your head there. You in agreement with that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think we've been really focused on the governance and the data movement side of that equation. But I think we're going to start tilting more towards the intelligence aspect of it and the analytics component of that. And how do we leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence to derive more intelligence out of the data assets that we currently have.
And Jeanne, last word.
I would echo all of that, plus a real focus on equity, measures, and meaning, how we measure that, how we start to, pull out the embedded racism that happens to be embedded throughout our society and in government processes, and really being able to move forward with some of the digital transformation of government services to make it contactless, safer, and easier to work with government everywhere.
That's a great final comment. So I'd like to, on behalf of ActiveNav and the audience, I'd like to thank each member of the panel for giving up their time today and contributing to a really engaging conversation. And our contact details are on the screen there. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have follow-on questions. And again, thanks to everyone for attending today. I hope you found the session valuable, and I'm sure there's many nuggets of information and insights that you can now take away and have discussions within your own organization. So thank you very much.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Exactly. Stay safe.